let's explore maybe how those efforts impact maybe marketability and acceptance. I know we talked about it there with that, but expanding on the success stories, can you tell us how any big ways that culturalization has not only opened up a new market or maybe possibly averted big giant cultural conflicts or anything?
Yeah, there's times where you have to make hard decisions about what you want to do as a creator and as a company. And a lot of times that's why in recent years, I've been giving talks that focus not just on culturalization, but on your values and how your values as a creator and as a company or organization influence what you want to create and influence the decisions that you make. China being the largest film market and the largest gaming market in the world, as most people know, China has some pretty interesting restrictions on what they are willing to show or not show in their content. And so a lot of companies have to make a really hard choice there and say, do we want to bend over backwards to make a version for China that we know is not going to be compatible probably with a lot of other places of the world? So it's a lot of effort. Are we going to go make all that effort so we can sell our game in China, which typically has to be done through a local Chinese company as a partner? It's not just something you can go in and do yourself. Or are we just going to focus on the rest of the world and not worry about China? And more recently, with China becoming more and more strict about some of the things that they're allowing, and especially with political and social overtones, there's a lot of companies I've been seeing which are based on their values, especially companies more in the West, where they have leaned very heavily into inclusivity and diversity and wanting to be very inclusive of all kinds of people from walks of life and from different demographics. Once China declared back in 2019 that they did not want to see LGBTQ representation in games, that was the deal breaker for a lot of companies, where they were just like, okay, that's it. Then we're not even going to try to sell into China, because to make a version for China under those conditions directly violates what we consider to be some of our core values as creators, to be inclusive. And that's one of those things where oftentimes it's a bit of a challenge for the company, because they can see the revenue sitting out there in a certain market, but they have to make that crucial decision to say, that's revenue that we are not going to chase because it's going to
far.
Yeah, it's going to cross the line.
The effort to change the values drastically enough to go collect that.
Yeah. And I mean, I can show another example along these lines. This happened a while back with Age of Empires. And again, this is a pretty well-documented example, so it's not like I'm showing anything that's unknown. But basically, this is a good example of what's going on back in the day when Microsoft was growing its gaming business back in the 90s. And they basically knew that they wanted to go as many places as possible because they're creating a whole new vertical for themselves, starting with PC games. They already had Flight Sim, but then they, of course, built on that with other games like Age of Empires. And the first Age of Empires had this scenario in the game, which is from the Middle Ages, and so you're playing as the Choson Empire in Korea over on the left in red. And what happened, what history tells us really happened, is that the Japanese invaded the Choson Empire and almost completely took it over. And so that's Japan in blue, and so they made an invasion over to the Korean Peninsula and almost took it over. However, so basically that's the scenario that was put in the game because the developers said, hey, if you play as the Chosen Empire, what a great scenario, because it's like a very difficult level to win because you've got this overwhelming Japanese force coming at you. So how are you supposed to win this battle? And they said that's a great scenario for a game. That's why they put it in the game. The game was released in South Korea, and the game was banned in South Korea because of this, because the Ministry of Information in Korea said that this never happened. And they actually meant that, historically speaking, their history teaches that this did not happen, that Japan did not have an overwhelming invasion of the Chosen Empire. And it did basically because, as is the role of the Korean Ministry of Information, they are protecting the image of Korea, and they felt that this doesn't reflect well on the Korean history. And so they basically said we're not allowing the game to release with this particular scenario. So now we're faced with a hard decision. What are we supposed to do? Because again, we're trying to grow the business, it would create a new vertical. And the important thing is that market research told us that South Korea is an extremely important gaming market. And it is. It is an extremely important gaming market even to this day. And so basically we felt like we had no choice but to modify the scenario because we wanted to release the game. It was too difficult to just take it out completely. So what we did instead was modify the scenario, and the modification essentially was changing history. So now, instead of Japan invading Korea, Korea is now invading Japan, which did not happen. As far as we're aware, that did not happen back in those days with the Choson Empire. Now, as you can imagine, this created a lot of conversation on the development team about the nature of truth and ethics, because we are serving government propaganda.
To your own facts, I can imagine, is the question that came up.
Yeah, because we are now a vehicle for serving up government propaganda in the South Korean market. And that is how people characterized it, the people, on the team. And they're not incorrect. But it is a business decision that had to be made, because this was essentially the only way that we were going to release this game in South Korea. And it was only for South Korean players who saw this. Everywhere else in the world, they saw the scenario on the top. I also had to remind people, though, when we were making this decision about changing history, that a few years earlier, when I was working on Encarta Encyclopedia, in the French and Italian versions of the encyclopedia, we had different heights for the mountain Mont Blanc that sits on their border, because at the time, the two governments disagreed on the height of the mountain by just a few centimeters. And because an encyclopedia is an educational resource, it has to conform to local educational standards. And the standards meant that the mountain was different heights in the two different countries. So we had to change the height of the mountain in two different language versions in order to sell those products into those markets. So this is not that different from that. It's a little more blatant because it's an actual historical scenario. But whether it's a physical mountain that we're changing the size of, or we're changing something that happened in time, it's the issue's the same. Is that you are making a modification, consciously modifying the product in a way that is making an alternate version of reality, and which is not unlike what we're seeing in a lot of media spaces today anyway. But the important part of all of this, of course, is the fact that we did it very consciously. We weren't just we weren't being haphazard or careless about this. We thought this through and all the implications of this very carefully, and decided to go ahead and make the decision that we made.
Awesome. Those examples perfectly set up, almost a segue in and of themselves